the Concord.
Now, on the 20th century, guns and God, the sieges at Waco and Ruby Ridge. Both were avoidable tragedies brought on by bad judgment and bureaucratic bungling, but to a militant minority, they were bitter episodes in a conspiracy to subvert the Constitution and destroy individual freedoms.
And if the government continues to distance itself from the people, then war is inevitable.
The story of how healthy skepticism about government slid into dangerous paranoia. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century. Ever since colonial Americans revolted against taxation without representation and declared their independence from King George's England, there has always been an anti-government, anti-establishment tradition in our politics. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said back in the mid-19th century, the less government we have, the better. That is why for many Americans, the 50-year growth in the size of the federal government that began with the New Deal no longer made sense in the 1990s. They'd had it with big government. And nowhere was that more evident than on election night, 1994.
The Republican revolution of election 94 shook Capitol Hill like an earthquake today. Its reverberations went into state houses and moved the whole political landscape sharply to the right.
But the climate that swept a new conservative majority into Congress also had a more ominous component. A radical right wing that saw the federal government's intrusiveness as part of a huge conspiracy to take away people's rights.
Sort of like the Wizard of Oz. There's somebody behind the curtains actually making things happen. And they
Kenneth Stern, a lawyer and an expert on political extremism in America, is the author of A Force Upon the Plain, the American Militia Movement, and the Politics of Hate.
By the end of 1994, there were militia groups in 20 states. By the time I was writing a report in early April 1995 warning about the militia movement, there were militia groups in over 36 states. And by March of 1996, I'm not aware of any state that doesn't have some militia presence.
Hamilton, Montana. Population about 2,700. Most of the people ruggedly individualistic.
And some of them linked to the militia of Montana, extremely resentful of what they saw as rampant government intervention in their lives, in the form of restrictions on land use, grazing rights, gun control. Many had lost faith in the ballot box as a means of resolving their grievances. Radical problems demanded radical solutions. Solutions like bomb threats at the courthouse and a death threat to a county official.
We have a group that really believes they can set up their own common law court. They can do as they please. They can live a life bounded only by their belief in God and the Constitution.
The wildlife is owned by...
Like this man, Calvin Greenup, charged with advocating acts of violence against public officials because he thought they had overreached their authority and were therefore guilty of treason.
Calvin's a man who believes that he's the last of the true American patriots, but he doesn't believe in the government of the United States of America. And he is adamantly opposed to most of the restrictions that government wants to put on everyday life. The American legal system doesn't exist to them.
Or to Greenup's friend, Alan Hamilton, who this day was in court for threatening a police officer over an expired license plate.
I have not seen a signed complaint. I have not seen a signed affidavit.
Because Hamilton believed presiding Judge Jeff Langton had no authority, he tried to put the judge on trial.
And it's your job to arrest this man for treason.
Mr. Hamilton,
This is not a trial.
Mr. Hamilton,
you cannot even give me a
Mr. Hamilton.
You're saying that there are a couple dozen people who have virtually paralyzed this small community?
I think that's a pretty good assessment.
But Hamilton, Montana was not an isolated case.
The Lord himself.
In many parts of the country, anti-government zealots organized into independent militias,
Militia of Montana, this is...
communicating with each other through newsletters and pamphlets, white supremacist radio broadcasts, even computer bulletin boards on the internet. Their zeal was driven by dark visions of something called the New World Order.
What they believe is that this New World Order wants to subjugate Americans, wants to take away their individual liberties, wants to take away their freedom.
Our biggest enemy in America right now is domestic government officials.
It's sad when you can't trust people, but that's where we've gotten.
For people like the Greenups, two events in the 1990s came to symbolize the determination of the federal government to destroy individual rights. The siege of the Branch Davidians outside Waco, Texas, and the standoff between the FBI and Randy Weaver in Ruby Ridge, Idaho.
This government doesn't care about life. Who raided Waco, Texas? Was it BATF? Was it FBI? Yes.
Randy Weaver.
Randy Weaver.
Randy Weaver and his wife Vicki believed so strongly in non-interference from the government that they left Iowa and moved their family to a secluded cabin in northern Idaho. Like many others in the area, known as Ruby Ridge, their goal was to live as far as possible from the reach of government. But when Randy Weaver was charged with selling 2 sawed-off shotguns to a Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms informant, and then failed to show up for his court date, U.S. Marshals tried to arrest him.
The showdown began when Sammy Weaver and his dog Striker heard noises outside the family cabin on a lonely mountaintop called Ruby Ridge in northern Idaho. Chuck Peterson, an attorney for the Weaver family, picks up the story there.
Suddenly, the dog was standing up here with its legs up in the hill, barking, and in those woods were the marshals.
It was August 21st, 1992. U.S. Marshals had been watching the family cabin for 18 months. They wanted to arrest Sammy Weaver's father, Randy, on weapons charges, but it would not be easy.
The family was heavily armed. The dogs were alert, and on this day sniffed out the marshals. And now, as lawyer Peterson recalled, it was the lawmen on the run, the dog and the Weavers at their heels. Down this path to a fork where they turned.
They got about to this point,
and all hell broke loose. The FBI later filmed the scene. Agent shot the dog here. A marshal died there. Sammy further up the trail.
Sammy turns like this and starts to run, and as he's running up the hill, he gets hit once in the elbow, and then it's about at this location that he gets hit the second time. He says, I'm coming, Dad, and he gets hit in the back and drops and dies right here.
A 14-year-old boy was dead, as was a decorated U.S. Marshal. Now the battle lines were drawn even more sharply. Lawmen on one side, Weaver family supporters on the other.
Your baby killer! Baby killer!
FBI snipers managed to move closer to the cabin, operating under orders later found to be unlawful because they violated FBI guidelines on the use of deadly force. In essence, the government sharpshooters at Ruby Ridge were authorized to shoot on sight anyone who was armed, instead of being restricted to firing on an armed individual only when confronted with an imminent threat to life. The next day, one sniper, operating under the more relaxed rules, shot Weaver's wife, Vicki, by mistake, as she held her infant daughter in her arms.
Unfortunately, Vicki is dead.
Even then, Randy Weaver and a friend staying with him, Kevin Harris, refused to surrender.
For 9 long days, Randy Weaver has been holed up in this remote mountain cabin in Idaho, surrounded by an army of police and federal agents. Weaver is a white supremacist, wanted on gun charges.
Dishonor him all his saints!
But to the assorted tax revolters, survivalists, skinheads, and other supporters who kept a vigil near his cabin, Weaver was a folk hero, a man who was standing up to the evil federal government.
Pray for Vicki and Randy and Kevin and the girls and for little Sam. Praise Yahweh! Praise Yahweh!
Then, finally, after 11 days of defiance,
44-year-old Randy Weaver surrendered with his 3 surviving children. The siege at the remote cabin began with a gunfight that left a U.S. Marshal and Weaver's 14-year-old son dead.
Semi-automatic rifle.
Right from the start, there were claims that the U.S. Marshals and the FBI had botched the operation, that overreaction and itchy trigger fingers had caused the deaths not only of U.S. Marshal William Deegan, but of Vicki and Sammy Weaver as well.
Never will you take another woman down. Never.
Beyond the few who shared Randy Weaver's extremist anti-government views, the siege at Ruby Ridge was an unfortunate but isolated event. A year later, that perception changed dramatically. Randy Weaver went on trial on the original weapons charges, and as the trial progressed and more facts surfaced about how federal agents had bungled the case, another violent standoff riveted the nation and seemed to cast what had happened at Ruby Ridge in a whole new light. The scene of the new showdown was a windswept plain 1,000 miles south. The case involved an obscure religious sect, which shared with Randy Weaver a love not only of God, but of guns. David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, when the 20th century returns.
Big jobs.
But when faith crosses the line into fanaticism, the consequences can be deadly. Less than a year after the siege at Ruby Ridge, the FBI and the ATF found themselves in another shootout, another tense standoff. This time with a religious commune in a heavily armed compound, and this time in front of TV cameras, carrying it live to the entire nation. In the minds of many, what happened outside Waco, Texas, looked like a replay of Ruby Ridge, with an even more dramatic and deadly climax. Some called it Mount Carmel. Others used the name Ranch Apocalypse to describe the home of a little-known and little-understood fundamentalist Christian sect called the Branch Davidians. Led by David Koresh, a high school dropout with a messianic vision, the Davidians had come to the attention of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms because of their growing stockpile of assault weapons and explosives.
Agents working undercover infiltrated the cult, attending services for more than a month. They found each day after the service the men, women, and children separated to different locations. Only Koresh was allowed to be intimate with the women, and only Koresh had the key to the gun room with all of the weapons inside.
Armed with both search warrants and weapons of their own, a team of 30 ATF agents, backed up by 70 state and local officers, entered the Davidian compound on February 28, 1993.
The warrant was for Branch Davidian's 33-year-old leader, Vernon Howell, also known as David Koresh, who claims to be the Lamb of God and admits his 75-member sect stockpiles assault weapons in preparation for Armageddon. The men and women who work for ATF prepare for and carry out hundreds of these raids every year. This time something went terribly wrong.
The first agents in found that the men were armed and ready. 3 agents who went through the gunroom window were killed. Another died leaving his car.
We're taking fire from those guys. Tell Wayne that ATF will cease fire, that they will cease fire, and we'll pull back. It sounds like they're firing now. That y'all are making the move, and they're going to defend themselves to the last man.
The gunfire continued for 45 minutes, and by then 4 federal agents were dead, another 16 wounded. At least 2 Branch Davidians were killed. Then a ceasefire was called, and the ATF retreated.
I don't believe it's that we were outmaneuvered or outplanned. The problem we had is that we were outgunned.
Hold to the right!
A standoff began. Federal agents were now painfully aware that the Branch Davidians, who also called themselves God's Marines, would not give up without a fight.
They come in here with a gun, and they start shooting at us. What would you do? Tell me, be realistic. This is America. This is not Australia. This is not Europe. This is not where a country overthrows a bunch of people, takes away their weapons so that the people cannot argue any issues.
We didn't come in with guns smoking. We announced our presence and said we had a warrant. It happens all over this country, night after night after night. If it's justifiable to shoot a law enforcement officer because you're somehow protecting your home against somebody who's serving a lawful warrant, then God help us.
He inclined to me when he heard my...
But the only law Koresh's followers obeyed came in the form of teachings from their leader.
So how's God going to talk to me in the latter days?
Well, he is a very charismatic individual. He's a good speaker. He knows how to do a heck of a tap dance through the Bible.
And he profoundly believed in polygamy.
Yeah, I was his wife. I was, and so was my daughter, and so was 15 other people in there.
He truly believes that he's the Son of God. I don't.
You believed that for a while, too.
Probably like for a month.
On March the 1st, 1993, one day into the standoff, the FBI came in to help the ATF end the siege. But instead, the FBI found itself negotiating an endless series of unfulfilled promises of surrender. First, Koresh said he would come out if radio stations broadcast his message.
I, David Koresh, agree upon the broadcasting of this tape to come out peacefully. All the people here at the facility compound here, as y'all call it, will give ourselves over to the world.
Prison buses were brought in, local hospitals put on standby, but by late afternoon, an obvious snag.
I've just got off the phone with ATF. They advised me that we are still in a standoff position at Mount Carmel.
Koresh had backed out of his promise to surrender, explaining that he was waiting for a message from God.
We are going through a very frustrating and disappointing period in the negotiation process. Once we appear to be going forward and meeting what they are requesting, oftentimes they are rejecting even proposals that they have submitted.
In the first 10 days of the siege, Koresh's only concession was the release of 21 children and 2 elderly women.
In Texas, authorities say they are willing to wait as long as necessary to work out a peaceful end to the siege there.
Well, what all of us want to do is to make sure there are no more deaths and no more injuries, so we're prepared to take as long as it takes to come to that conclusion. So yes, we're prepared to sit there for a long time.
But as the days of the impasse began to turn into weeks, Koresh kept stalling, saying that his refusal to surrender was a matter of God's will. The FBI decided to step up the pressure on Koresh to get him to give up. Government helicopters flew over the compound by day. By night, lights and noise disrupted normal sleep patterns. It was the beginning of week number 3, and authorities had a face-to-face meeting with Koresh's top aides to try to negotiate a settlement.
There was an attempt on our part to get the conversations moving again and to try and get something triggered here that might lead to the resolution of this incident.
But nothing was resolved. Some observers began to wonder if the standoff would ever end. Frustrated, the FBI and ATF cranked up the pressure another notch.
An armored tank rolled into the front yard of the besieged compound and unceremoniously pushed aside and destroyed a boat belonging to the Branch Davidians. The armor also knocked down trees and part of a wall.
Vernon Howell thinks he's the Lamb of God, when all he is a cheap thug who interprets the Bible through the barrel of a gun.
Cult members unfurled another accusation from an upstairs window, a banner which said, FBI, God sees your lies. On the other side, a renewed sense of frustration seems to have set in among agents who had hoped the Branch Davidians' Passover holiday might bring an end to the 41-day standoff.
Koresh might have observed Passover, but not his promise to surrender.
In an overnight telephone conversation, he started cursing negotiators, acting as one federal official characterized it, not like a representative of Jesus Christ. Agents hung up on him.
Hopes for the siege ending anytime soon seemed to evaporate when it was announced that David Koresh was writing his interpretation of the biblical 7 seals contained in the book of Revelations.
Mr. Koresh does not have any more than a 9th grade education, so he does not write very well. So everything will have to be rewritten. So I figure 4 or 5 months tops.
But federal agents were not about to wait another 4 or 5 months. There were rumors of child abuse going on inside the compound. On the 51st day of the standoff, David Koresh's time ran out.
Early this morning, armored vehicles entered cult leader David Koresh's compound and began punching large holes in the walls. Koresh and about 90 of his followers are believed to be inside.
Tear gas was pumped through the holes in an effort to force the Davidians out of the compound.
Throughout the morning, the tanks went in, taking hostile fire from cult members, saturating the compound with choking gas.
The occupants in the compound were advised, this is not an assault. Do not fire. If you fire, your fire will be returned. We are introducing non-lethal tear gas.
Authorities said they believed the tear gas would prevent a massive, long-rumored suicide pact from being fulfilled. But they were wrong.
As an armored vehicle administered another dose of tear gas, the Branch Davidian brought the house down around them. Smoke, then flames erupted from the second floor. FBI sharpshooters say they witnessed cult members setting fires in at least 2 locations. Whipped by the stiff Texas wind, reportedly fueled by kerosene and explosives stored inside, the fire engulfed the compound within minutes. No one expected a biblical-style inferno.
I can't tell you the shock and the horror that all of us felt when we saw those flames coming out there. It was, oh my God, they're killing themselves. We did not want that to occur.
Still, it took a full 30 minutes for the fire trucks to reach the compound, and by that time there was nothing left to save. The building was reduced to ashes and rubble. Of the more than 80 men, women, and children inside, only 9 had survived. David Koresh was not among them.
He had predicted all this to happen. He told us that it would end up this way, that he would be a martyr.
Well, I think a lot of questions need to be asked about why today, why was it so important to run those tanks in there and the tear gas today? Why couldn't it wait to see if this would be a peaceful solution like David assured us that it would be?
I don't think it was mishandled. I think the FBI has acted very professionally, very ably, and with remarkable restraint.
But the mother of a cult member killed in the initial ATF assault 51 days earlier said both sides shared responsibility.
All those people that went in there to study the Bible, they were misguided. Yes, they were led astray by David Koresh, and they're victims of David Koresh, but now they're also victims of our government.
For many Americans in and outside government, the deaths of the Branch Davidians were a horrible tragedy, raising serious questions about the tactics and strategy of both the FBI and ATF. The fallout from Waco when the 20th century returns.
Before you hit the wall, hit Sherwin-Williams for the best.
It is hard to believe that less than a year after the debacle at Ruby Ridge, ATF and FBI agents would make the same over-aggressive mistakes in Texas, but they did. The siege outside Waco was laced with bureaucratic bungling, poor communication, cover-ups, and worst of all, a military mindset that opted for confrontation instead of patience and prudence.
We don't want to second guess, but on the other hand, the worst possible result happened from this operation. A lot of lives lost, and so a lot of questions arise as to whether this was the most appropriate course of action to be taken.
The fallout from the catastrophe outside Waco began almost before the ashes that once were the Branch Davidian compound were cold. The favorite target of the critics was Attorney General Janet Reno.
I made the decision. I'm accountable. The buck stops with me, and nobody ever accused me of running from a decision.
And it wasn't.
She offered to resign because of what happened, but President Clinton promptly rejected it. Still, there was plenty of second-guessing, especially from the Congress.
This is a profound disgrace to law enforcement in the United States of America. And you did the right thing by offering to resign. And now I'd like you to know that there is at least one member in the Congress that isn't going to rationalize the death of 24 children.
I haven't tried to rationalize the death of children, Congressman. I feel more strongly about it than you will ever know. But I have neither tried to rationalize the death of 4 ATF agents. But most of all, Congressman, I will not engage in recrimination. I will look to the future.
Nevertheless, recriminations over the performance of FBI and ATF agents continue to grow.
There was incredible stupidity, incompetence, and provocation by a reckless and overreaching federal agency.
We watched families, our friends, my son's wife, his children, all burn up before our very eyes. And we're pretty hurt.
And this is a terrible case of abuse of power. This started with an abuse of power when the ATF went in there like the Marines storming the beach, and it ended with an abuse of power when they made the wrong decision to start pushing over walls and inserting tear gas with tanks. Now, why didn't they wait? That question really needs to be asked over and over again.
The question is, do we have any regrets? We always have regrets when human life is lost. What we do not regret is that we believe that this thing had to be brought to a logical conclusion at some point. We did not want this to occur. At some point, we had to up the ante.
But many wondered why the FBI and the ATF felt pressured to act when they did. One reason? Simple fatigue.
We made some judgments based on the fact that experts told us that the hostage rescue team should not and could not remain in place for any permanent period of time without being relieved.
Another reason for the final assault, to protect the children inside the compound from further abuse.
Remember, David Koresh had a history of abuse. He married an 11-year-old girl in the compound. He took different wives at will, and the children were beaten several times. Now, there is no specific evidence, as the FBI director said, that there was child abuse going on, say, Friday or Saturday night, but there was an awful lot of evidence that there had been child abuse over time in that compound.
Also at issue was why it took so long to bring in firefighters to put out the blaze.
While federal agents were prepared for a shootout with cult members, it's clear from tapes of the first calls to local fire stations that they never expected the compound to go up in flames.
Sheriff's office dispatch. Is this Hofburg? Yeah, it is. Okay, they got a fire out the compound.
Yo, mate.
And are y'all en route?
No, we're looking at it. We're just waiting for you.
Okay, take off then.
By the fall of 1993, an independent investigation commissioned by Treasury Secretary Lloyd Benson had come to its own damning conclusions, particularly about the botched ATF raid and subsequent efforts to cover up mistakes.
I was deeply disappointed by what I learned, but knowing human nature, I wasn't totally surprised, yes.
The report revealed intelligence information ignored and orders disobeyed, starting on day one, when the raid continued in direct violation of commands to abort the mission if the element of surprise was blown.
The two raid leaders were told clearly by an undercover agent that Koresh knew they were coming. After the raid, the commanders claimed they hadn't been told and tried to blame the failure on the undercover agent. But others told the truth.
61 agents told us that they heard the deputy raid commander say, "Hurry up, they know we're coming."